Well, you just picked the wrong guy for what you want.
Did I?
Yeah, I'm not on the market.
I wasn't shopping.
For decades, Paul Newman was the image of Hollywood perfection, the blue-eyed rebel, the faithful husband, and the star the world thought it knew. But beneath the spotlight lived a quieter truth, one Newman carried in silence for most of his life. Hidden in the shadows were names he never spoke aloud, names tied to love, loss, and the kind of secrets Hollywood demanded he bury. What happens when a man finally reveals the love he was never allowed to claim? And how do those hidden stories reshape the legend we thought we knew? Join us as we step into the untold confessions of Paul Newman, the men he loved in secret. The loves Paul Newman couldn't keep. For years, Paul Newman kept a story filled with shadows of love that could never exist in the daylight. At its heart stood Marlon Brando, a man Newman once described with the awe one might reserve for a raging storm. Their paths crossed in 1954 at a Hollywood party, but Brando wasn't mingling like everyone else. Barefoot in the corner, a cigarette hanging from his lips, he scanned the room until his gaze met Paul's. Words were unnecessary. Their attraction towards each other was painfully obvious. Their affair unfolded in stolen moments and hidden places. Brando was unpredictable, tender one moment, untamed the next. He cooked bare-chested in the kitchen, danced barefoot to jazz records, and sometimes vanished for days without explanation. When he returned, he acted as if nothing had happened. Newman never pressed for answers. To love Brando was to accept the storm in all its moods. And yet, in the chaos, there were moments of aching stillness. One night, Brando whispered, "You're the only one I don't lie to." Another morning, they watched the sun rise from a New York rooftop, their hands entwined, invisible to a city that would never forgive what it could not understand.
Here's some hot coffee for you. I guess you can use it after last night, huh? Oh, what a night.
But love like theirs could not last. Rumors began to swirl, photographs threatened to surface, and a studio executive made a quiet warning call. When Brando arrived at Newman's apartment, his expression was dark and final. "They know," he said. Newman offered to run away, to disappear together, but Brando only gave a sad smile. "You still think we get to choose how this ends?" With that, he left, never to return. He became another Hollywood ghost in Newman's life. Newman would see his name in scandals and gossip, but in his heart, Brando remained the barefoot man by the pool, grapes in hand, looking at him like the only truth in a city built on lies. Newman kept a single postcard from Brando, a picture of a burning house with 4 haunting words on the back. "We could have had this." If Brando was Newman's storm, Newman's next romantic escapade was the spark that burned too fast. The spark Paul Newman never forgot. Their meeting wasn't dramatic as that of Brandon's. It happened quietly in the shadowed corners of the Warner Brothers lot. Dean was still new to Hollywood, and he had a strange kind of magnetism that seemed to follow him everywhere. Paul, older and more polished, thought he had learned how to protect himself, but Dean disarmed him. Something about the younger actor made him feel 17 again. It began with subtle glances. Paul remembered catching Dean watching him from across a soundstage. Instead of looking away, Dean simply smiled, slow, certain, like he already knew where this would lead. Their first kiss happened in a parked car on a rainy night. The windows were fogged, the air thick with silence. Dean had leaned closer and whispered, "Don't you ever get tired of pretending?" Paul didn't answer. Instead, he kissed him. For the first time in years, it felt real, but they could never be public. Hollywood would never allow it. But behind closed doors, they lived boldly. They sped through Laurel Canyon on midnight drives, their laughter echoing into the night. They drank coffee at dimly lit diners, sitting just a little too close, daring anyone to notice. Sometimes they slipped away to Palm Springs, where they swam in private pools, shared stolen kisses, and lived whole weekends without lies. James was wild in his own way, but softer than Brando. He didn't hide from emotions, even if they frightened him. One night, stretched out on Paul's apartment floor, he turned serious. "If I die young, promise me you'll tell them who I really was. Not the image, not the jacket." Me, Paul promised, not realizing how soon he would be tested.
Good idea.
On September 30th, 1955, James Dean's car crash ended everything. He was just 24. The news struck Newman like a bullet. For days, he locked himself away, blinds closed, refusing to speak. At the funeral, he stayed in the back, silent and hidden, wearing a leather jacket James had once tried on in front of the mirror, grinning like a boy. Paul carried the loss quietly. He kept two treasures, a private photograph of Dean asleep on his chest and a short letter dated just 5 days before the accident. It read, "You make me feel like I might actually get to stay alive." Newman never shared it, but every year on the anniversary of Dean's death, he pulled it out and read it again. Later in life, when asked about love, Newman spoke carefully. "He was the brightest thing I ever touched, and the fastest to disappear." Their time together lasted only a few months, but Paul Newman never denied what Dean had been to him, his first real love. However, Paul Newman was not one to sulk forever. He soon found himself entangled in another web of adventure. The wound Paul could never heal. Paul first met him in 1956 at a dinner party. Monty sat alone at the far end of the table, a glass of bourbon in hand, humming faintly to himself. His presence drew Paul in because of the sadness that seemed to live behind his eyes. Paul took the empty seat beside him. They hardly spoke that night, just shared a cigarette, listened to the music, and sat in a silence that somehow felt louder than words. Days later, Monty called him, and with just a single sentence, "You feel like the only safe place in this town," something fragile began. It wasn't exactly love, and it wasn't just friendship. It was a delicate...
"And your mother? I trust she's well. We've never met, you know, but I've heard her mentioned from time to time, and she wrote..."
Undefinable bond. Monty was a man of secrets. Layers upon layers he rarely let anyone see. He understood too well how Hollywood chewed men like him apart, reshaped them, or erased them completely. Yet with Paul, he lowered his defenses, just enough. Together, they carved out moments of peace in stolen hours. They would spend entire nights lying on the floor, trading lines of poetry and passing a bottle of gin back and forth. On weekends, they fled to hidden cabins where they could exist as nobodies, free from cameras and questions. One evening, Monty whispered something Paul never forgot. "If I die young, make sure they know I didn't go untouched." It was as if he already knew what fate had prepared. That same year, tragedy struck. In May 1956, leaving Elizabeth Taylor's home, Monty crashed his car into a telephone pole. His jaw was wired shut, his face permanently scarred. The Hollywood that had once praised him didn't offer comfort. Instead, it turned away in silence. The phone calls stopped, the roles diminished, and the admiration vanished. To Paul, it wasn't the accident that truly broke him. It was the cruel indifference that followed. Paul visited him during recovery, bringing flowers and reading aloud from their favorite poems. Monty rarely spoke. He stared out the window as if he had already withdrawn from the world. Slowly, they drifted apart by something larger than either could fight. In 1966, Monty was found dead in his apartment. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, but Paul quietly admitted he never believed it. Monty didn't die in 1966. He died the day he realized the world would never let him love out loud. Years later, Paul discovered an envelope tucked away in a drawer. Inside was a blurred photograph of the two of them, smiling in a sunlit kitchen. On the back, Monty had written, "I was never brave, but with you, I thought about trying." But not all his relationships ended in fatal tragedies. The secret that chose survival. When Paul Newman crossed paths with Anthony Perkins, the younger actor was already famous and already hiding. His chilling role in Psycho had turned him into a household name. But what audiences never saw was the real terror that lived off-screen. Behind the polite smile and soft voice was a man who had been taught to erase himself in order to survive. From the day he signed his first contract, Hollywood had begun reshaping him. Agents, directors, and publicists worked tirelessly to ensure that the world never mistook his softness for what it was, queerness. He was told to lower his voice, walk differently, smile more confidently, date women for the cameras, and never linger too long when looking at another man. Every gesture had to be rehearsed, every glance monitored. Desire had no place in the image the industry demanded of him. But beneath it all, he wanted Paul. Their first meeting happened almost by accident, backstage at a charity event. Paul barely remembered the moment until Anthony reached out to steady a falling glass, his hand brushing against Paul's elbow. He didn't pull away quickly enough, and in that fraction of a second, Paul felt the spark. not of lust, but of recognition. Later that night, they found themselves on a rooftop, their legs dangling over the ledge while Los Angeles shimmered below. Anthony asked unusual questions, the kind that revealed his restless heart. Did Paul believe in parallel lives? Did he think people like them could ever be happy somewhere else? Paul didn't have the answers, but he knew that night neither of them slept alone. Their time together was unlike Paul's other loves. It wasn't reckless fire like Brando. It wasn't the aching tenderness of Monty. With Anthony, everything was quiet, coded, careful. Their bond existed in stolen glances and unspoken rules. They never shared a hotel room. They never rode in the same car. They never signed a note with their real names. Even when they were together behind locked doors, Anthony rarely allowed himself to fully relax. He was always listening for footsteps, always watching the shadows. Once, Paul asked him softly, "Don't you ever get tired of hiding?" Anthony's answer came without hesitation. "Hiding is the only thing keeping me alive." He had seen what happened to others. Men whispered about until their careers crumbled, their reputations were destroyed, and their names were dragged through scandal. He didn't want to be a martyr. He wanted to keep working, to keep disappearing into characters because pretending felt safer than being himself. In time, Anthony pulled away with quiet apology. He married a woman, had children, and Hollywood applauded, relieved that he had conformed to the story they needed him to tell. But Paul knew the truth. Anthony hadn't fallen out of love. He had simply fallen deeper into fear. Years later, at an industry event, they crossed paths again. Anthony walked past him without a word, but as he brushed by, his hand slipped a folded note into Paul's jacket. Hours later, Paul unfolded it and found just one sentence.
In the office, for instance, I'm always prepared. You can't just crash in on me there, I should say not.
In another world, I never let go. But not all of them were scared of public opinion like Anthony. Paul's next experience was the direct opposite of his experience with Anthony. The boy who loved too openly. People often said Sal Mineo carried a brightness that was almost too pure for Hollywood. When Paul first met him, he noticed that Sal had not yet been hardened by the industry. He was young, full of energy, and spoke quickly, as though pausing might allow the truth to catch up to him. Unlike many others, Sal hadn't learned how to hide his heart. Sal had just finished Rebel Without a Cause, and the press was calling him the next big star. Behind those glowing headlines, however, he was still just a boy hopeful and unaware of the brutal rules Hollywood enforced on men like him. He didn't understand secrecy, didn't grasp why affection had to be hidden, and Paul found that innocence beautiful, even dangerous. Their connection came fast. Sal admired Paul deeply and expressed it with childlike devotion. He scribbled notes filled with doodled hearts, left late-night voicemails just to hear Paul's voice, and smiled in ways that made his feelings obvious. Unlike others, Sal didn't whisper his love. He showed it openly. He would reach for Paul's hand in public, say his name with a softness that lingered too long, and glance at him without disguise. None of it was meant to provoke scandal. It was simply how Sal loved out loud. One evening, as they sat across from each other in a dimly lit booth, Sal gathered his courage. With trembling hands, he asked Paul to run away with him. He said it didn't need to be forever, just long enough for them to stop feeling like their love was wrong. From his coat pocket, Sal pulled out a small black velvet box. Inside was a simple ring, which made Paul freeze. He saw before him a boy who deserved a world of acceptance, and yet all Paul could feel was the weight of his own fear. He told himself he was too old, too tired, and too cautious to give Sal the life he wanted. So, with a quiet voice, he said no. Sal smiled as though he understood, but Paul noticed that his eyes never fully smiled again. Unfortunately, in February 1976, tragedy struck. Sal was stabbed to death outside his Los Angeles apartment. He was only 27, his life stolen in a moment of senseless violence. The world was shocked, but for Paul, the loss cut deeper. He didn't attend the funeral, though he sent lilies, Sal's favorite flowers, wrapped in gray ribbon. Not all of his love stories began with attraction at first sight, and his next affair was proof of this. The rival he couldn't hate. Paul Newman and Steve McQueen were never supposed to be friends. Steve carried the raw, untamed energy of a man who lived on impulse. America loved him for it, and the press thrived on comparing him to Paul. They framed it as a duel, the polished gentleman against the reckless outlaw. At first, Paul played along. He dismissed Steve as unruly, once remarking that McQueen behaved as though no one had ever dared to tell him no. Yet beneath Paul's annoyance lived something more complicated, a sharp tension that refused to be ignored whenever they shared the same space. That tension came to a head during a charity retreat in Big Sur. Producers had insisted they share a cabin, hoping time together would build chemistry for an upcoming project. Just as expected, they clashed over everything. The quarrels eventually dissolved into silence, one that grew heavy with something unnamed. And then Steve closed the gap and kissed Paul with the hunger of a man who had been holding back too long. Neither mentioned it the next morning.
I talked to your mother on the telephone exactly 5 minutes ago, and she seemed to be in perfect health.
But from that moment, something between them had shifted. On screen, their scenes burned with sharp intensity. Critics praised their chemistry, though neither gave it a name. Steve didn't believe in love. He believed in thrill, in heat, in living for the rush. And Paul, wiser and quieter, never tried to turn him into something he wasn't. Why did Paul never reveal these experiences before his death? What impact would these revelations have on his legacy? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.